Hello, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. It's great to have you here with us today. And today we've got a guest speaker called Tom Price, and I'm going to ask him a few questions. But before that, just two things that I wanted to share from my side. First, it's been great to journey with all of you the last few weeks. Chris and Abril, who have been leading with me, are on the 25th anniversary today, so they're off somewhere celebrating. The two things I wanted to share is that in October, November, we are going to do an alpha course, which actually looks at some of the big questions we are talking about. And on the 20th of July, we've added a new date for big questions because a lot of questions that have been asked don't really fit with the themes we've been looking at. So if you have more questions, just send them over, and we'll be looking at other big questions you might have, very random questions you might have, and depending on what the questions are, who the panel will be. So I'm really looking forward to receiving more questions, and 2 weeks before I'll send you who the panel will be, hopefully some of our guests, and that would be great. So I'm going to introduce you to Tom Price. Tom, would you like to say hello?
Hi, it's nice to be with you. Hello.
So, Tom, you live in Oxford. What do you do in Oxford? What's kind of your work?
So I am involved in working in training people to think about their faith or to explore questions of faith. So my technical job description is I'm an apologist, and I work in the field of Christian apologetics. But I'm really a philosopher, theologian, doing a doctorate at the moment through the University of Aberdeen, and I'm looking at questions in philosophy of religion, how they interact with film. But I've always been interested since I came to a Christian faith myself at university. I've always been interested in questions of the heart, questions of the mind, and finding ways to bring our questions into contact with spiritual and religious answers, and that's my interest, that's my field. I've been teaching and training evangelists here in Oxford in the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. I've been involved in teaching people to speak and to articulate their faith and to hopefully answer questions about their faith for the last 15 years or so.
Great. So yeah, you're perfect for what we're doing today. So we're going to shoot all the questions to you. I'm going to take advantage of this and ask my own questions, I think. And Tom, I hear that you are related to Andy Bridges. How are you related to Andy Bridges? Some people from church might know him.
So I'm married to Andy Bridges' sister, Caroline Bridges, who I met through the Levinson's son, John Levinson, at university. When Caroline came to visit him at university, I was introduced to Caroline, and I thought, wow, and have ended up being very, very happily married. We have 3 kids and live in Oxford together. And we're very, very thankful, both to the Bridges family, but also to the Levinsons as well.
Yeah, brilliant. We know the Levinsons around here. And Andy Bridges is best known for his role in Holiday Club. I don't know if you know the story, but he dressed up as one of the Star Trek guys. I can't remember who. And he's known as Captain Spock or whatever he was in the Holiday Club in front of kids. So you know on our side. And tell me, where did you get married?
So yeah, I mean, if you could get me some photos of that Holiday Club appearance, that would be very valuable to me in our family WhatsApp chat as well, if you can get hold of that. We actually got married at St. Giles Church. So we celebrated. Caroline herself came to faith through the youth work of St. George's and St. Giles. So we got married there, and you had a lovely sunny day, and a lovely old car drove us from Caroline's parents' house on Fairholme Crescent. And well, actually didn't drive me at that point, but drove Caroline, I think.
It's really strange. It's a small world, isn't it? I send an email to Kate, someone who works with you, to say like who could speak on this theme. faith in a pluralistic world, and it ended up being you who have all these connections with
Have
us.
loads of connections to St. George's, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So I think we can now start moving into your talk bit, and Tom is going to share about faith in a pluralistic world, and he kind of knows what he's talking about because he's been studying this for a while. So Tom, thanks very much, and over to you.
I don't know if I'm worthy of that introduction, but I've certainly got some thoughts that I hope will be helpful for you as you wrestle with this question with me. I still have questions in this area, some things I'm trying to figure out. And I'm frequently asked questions like, how can you say that there's only one way to God? How can you, who are you to say that Jesus is the only one that people should follow? And why can't God just welcome people who are sincere in their hearts, who seek him from any point of view or any religious system or any aspect? And these are really, really good questions, and they are asked by a large number of people, and they've been consistently asked through generations of people who are wondering about questions of life and faith. Now, we might find ourselves drawn towards Christ's message of love and forgiveness. We might find that an impressive message, and we might say our world needs that message. And we might also be drawn towards the Christian community, but we can find ourselves somewhat affronted or uncomfortable with the slightly more intolerant sounding claim that it's only through Christ that someone can have a relationship with God. I want to say that I get that. I get how that is a difficult thing to hear. That's a difficult thing to think. When people become religious, they tend to think that they're right and others are wrong. And this can lead to a kind of us and them thinking. The outsider could get depersonalized, and this can increase the amount of suspicion, division, and violence in society. And if something's exclusive, then it kind of means that the only place that you can get it is here, is this claim or this center. And aren't these exactly the sorts of ideas that society ought to now be calling out and rejecting in a pluralistic age? And when we look at the news over the last 15 years, 20 years, it's very clear that quite a high proportion of the conflict and the violence that we see in the world seems to occur between different religious groups or different sects. Each group thinking that they have the secret key or the truth or the exclusive truth. So the divisiveness of religion is a serious problem in the modern world. And in most of the different parts of the world, there are some strategies and responses to the problem of religious divisiveness. And there are three main ways that we tend to use in order to respond to this threat, this difficulty of the divisiveness of religion in society. One of those is, I think, adopting a pluralistic outlook. We'll come to that in a moment, but I want to describe these different approaches, and then I want to present a third way of dealing with the situation and of addressing the problem of the divisiveness of religion in society. So the first way that we can try to address the situation is that we try to stamp it out, maybe through government pressure or by controlling it, perhaps by enacting laws that curtail what you can do, what you can say, what you can believe. And there are some who try to attack or deal with religion directly, to try to pull it apart from the inside or to control it. And some governments have tried to do this. And this is exactly what's happened in China. Current estimates say that the percentage, though, of the entire Chinese population estimated to be Christians is moving from about 1% to about 45 to 50% over this current 100-year period. So this approach clearly doesn't work as a way of dealing with the problem of religious divisiveness. And Christianity seems particularly to flourish when Christians are stamped on in this kind of way. So the second way that you can try to deal with the problem of religious difference, religious divisiveness, the othering that can come with that, is by attacking its claims or undermining its power. we tend to respond then to the problem of religious divisiveness a bit differently in the West. And instead of addressing it through government control, we tend to attack and to undermine the confidence that people have in religious claims. And you can do this completely overtly, like some atheists who write books or make TV documentaries called The Root of All Evil, or How Religion Poisons Everything. But you can also read what I would call undercutting ideas about religion in any magazine, or you can see them in any TV program, any Netflix series you might watch. You'll pick up these sorts of ideas. And they are the ideas like religion should be kept personal and private, and all roads lead to the same place. In other words, let 1,000 religious flowers bloom in society and in our world, but don't bring that into social and public life together. Keep that separate from life together. And the reasoning here might look something like this. It might be exclusive claims are bad and mistaken. Why are they mistaken? Well, if you claim to have the truth, because of the limitations of your own pool of knowledge, what you can know, how you can't know everything, what you believe is going to be partly a product of the culture that you've emerged into and you're coming from, and it's the dominant narratives of that culture which are going to define what knowledge is, and they're going to control that's going to be something that's a product of the culture and the environment that you come from. So you can't say that you have any more of the truth than anyone else, because these knowledge claims about spiritual facts, they're just the products of the culture that you're in. You're born in a different culture, you'd have a different outlook. It's just a bit naive to make an exclusive claim. That's how the kind of thinking might go. And then there's a sort of illustrated example of this. That's the parable of the six. It's an old Hindu poem, the parable of the six blind Hindus who are all touching an elephant, that's used to illustrate the same idea. One blind man is touching the side of the elephant and he says, I can feel a wall. Another blind man is touching the ear of the elephant, and he says, I think it's a large leaf or a great tree. Another blind man is holding onto the leg of the elephant, and he says, is it something else here? Is it a tree? Another blind man took hold of the elephant's trunk, and he says, I think it's a snake. I think it's a snake here. That's what's here. And somebody else is touching the elephant's tusk and says it's a spear. Another blind man has the elephant's tail in his hand, and he's calling it a rope. And all of the blind men were touching the same reality, but they were understanding it differently. And people have used this parable, this old parable, to say that, and to share the idea that their opinion or their viewpoint, that no one religion should claim to be the one route to God. And it's sometimes used as a way of asserting or putting forward the idea that we should never, ever think that we possess definite or concrete claims about religion or religious realities or spiritual truths. We should never make those claims, and that's sometimes how it's asserted. I think it's really well intended, and I'm really sympathetic to it. And if this is where you're coming from, then I want to open up a really honest conversation about it. I don't think it works completely, but I really think it's well intended. And then I want to go on. After that conversation, I want to go on to try to describe a third way and to propose a third way of dealing with religious divisiveness. So the first thing I want to say is this, just for you to think about, is I completely agree that the search for truth means being open-minded, but I don't think that being open-minded means not being able to discover or to commit to the truth when we find it. We shouldn't be so open-minded that we don't commit to anything. And we shouldn't be so close-minded that we can't hear anything, we can't hear questions that people ask us. So being open-minded, I don't think means not, I don't think being open-minded means not being able to discover or commit to truth when we find it. The second thing is this. I'd like to just think for a moment about how important humility is. I've met and heard and been personally affected and offended by arrogant and dogmatic religious people who are so convinced that everything they think is right and everything anybody else thinks is completely wrong. And it's awful. And where that has happened to you and where that's been your experience of religious believers, particularly Christians, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Jesus tells his followers that they are to live with love and gentleness and respect. I just want to say sorry on that point. Humility is so, so important, but facts are not capable of being humble or arrogant. Let's say you go to the doctor and you have an infection, and the doctor says, this infection can be treated with this antibiotic, but not with this vitamin tablet. And then somebody says to you, well, that isn't very humble. I don't think we would refuse to take the antibiotic. If it's a fact, then it's true. If someone tells you a true idea in an arrogant way, then it can be totally unappealing, but it might still be true. Third thing I want to say is this. The nature of truth is exclusive. The nature of water is wet. If something is true and real by its nature, then it's going to exclude other things. Diamond is incredibly hard and tough, and therefore it is not also at the same time wet and soft. When something is true, it may exclude the opposite. And this is just part of what it means for something to be true. Reality isn't lacking in humility for being as it is. It's just the way it is. So if somebody says to you, Jesus is the only way to God, then we might not want to listen to that, especially if they're arrogant or if they're not kind in the way they explain it. But we shouldn't think that can't be true because it excludes other ways to get to God. Because if it's true, then it is true. The key question is it true? The fourth thing I want to say, just to think about here, is I want to ask a question about the blind man and the elephant. Did you notice the parable teller actually has a completely unique vantage point? The parable teller can see the entire elephant. And in some ways, the point here is that they can see into all of the different beliefs of all of the different people who each represent different religious approaches in the world, the great religious belief systems and philosophies and outlooks around the world. And from that more expansive and insightful viewpoint, they are saying this through the parable. I can see beyond you. I can see reality. I can see it's an elephant. I can see reality. But at the same time, they're saying something that contradicts what the message of the parable actually is, which is this. We think we can see. Nobody should claim that they can see reality. If anybody claims that they can see an elephant, then you shouldn't take them seriously. They don't really see. So there are these two things happening in the parable. We've got to figure that out and think a bit more deeply about that if we're to use that as a true illustration. How do they get that vantage point? And what informs that? What evidence do we have for that vantage point that they can really see reality? And we tend to think that the different religions of the world goes along with this. We tend to think that the different religions of the world all basically teach the same thing. Many of them have holy books, they have priests, they have communities, and they emphasize things like love and worship. But actually, when you look more deeply, the core teachings about the nature of God and the nature of reality, the nature of what it is to be human, the diagnosis about what's wrong with the world, what's wrong with human beings, what's broken, the solution to that, what we might call the salvific or the redemptive strategy, the final outcome and the description of heaven, all of these aspects are completely and utterly different in the different religions of the world. So as long as we don't mind them differing on view of God, what it is to be human, diagnosis of what's wrong with the world, answer to that, final outcome, picture of heaven, then we can say they're the same. But those are the fundamental ideas of religious belief systems. It's just not possible to believe that they teach the same thing. It's only possible to believe that at a sort of more superficial or outer level if we're not really engaging deeply with what those religions really claim. So if stamping out or controlling those unique and special claims to know God, if that doesn't work in terms of creating social cohesion and addressing religious divisiveness, we talked about China, and if we don't want to run around sort of undermining religious claims or trying to say to people that they can't know or they shouldn't know, then how can we move forwards? What is this third option to deal with the issue of religious divisiveness in society? And what might be better than control or pluralism? How can we keep an open mind whilst being able to discover and hold reasonable beliefs about reality, and then still live in a manner that doesn't divide and doesn't alienate and doesn't hurt other people? Let me put it like this. How can we live in a humble confidence with each other? I want to call this humble realism. This is a description then of what this might look like. It's to do with an ethic, it's to do with how we handle disagreement, and then it's to do with what we might be able to know, so the how and the what. So what would the ethic be like? Well, it might be that we approach it with humility and gentleness. Christ modeled an ethic of loving enemies, standing up for the overlooked and the forgotten, but he did so in a way that was gentle and careful, always being aware that we might be mistaken, and we should always be open to asking questions and testing what we believe carefully. There's an important principle from one of the stories of the early church called in Berea in Acts 17, where they test and check what they're being told to make sure that it's real. There's a sort of deep questioning that's expected as part of Christian faith. How do we handle disagreement? What would that look like? Well, we need to see people made in the image of God. Every single person is made in the image of God, whether they agree with us or not. They're deeply valued, they're wanted by God, and we need to value and esteem the other, even if they hold a completely and radically different point of view. We must defend them and their right to exercise their own freedom of belief and conscience, as long as it doesn't create violent situations. Then we need to defend their right to hold those beliefs. And we need to treat outsiders and the other, the outsider, in a loving and kind way, in the way that God treats the outsider. He goes to that outsider and beckons them to come in and to be with him. And then what can we know? What's the bounds? What's the content of the knowledge that we can know? Well, this is where the word realism comes in. I think that we need to humbly say that if we're careful and we use appropriate processes and tests for how we know the world, we can come to a secure knowledge about some things in the world. 3 tests, just sort of off the cuff, that you might use when you're testing and thinking about whether your beliefs are true, whether they match the way the world is. First of all, does it make sense? Is it logical? Does it cohere? Does it make sense when you think about it? Or is it incoherent? If something's incoherent, I don't think it's very likely to be true. But if something, it has that sort of elegant simplicity to it and it just makes sense, then actually that's a good sign that it might be true and real. Second thing is, does it tell it like it is? Does it describe the way things are? Does the idea you're considering believing about the world and holding firmly and confidently, does that idea match the way the world is? Does it describe the world as filled with a variety of different individuals, with human nature being good and bad in some examples? Does it describe the way the world is in a reliable and an accurate way? The third test we might use might be, what happens if we live it? Is it practically life-changing? Does it actually create a healthy society? Does it create a healthy life for ourselves? Does it promote flourishing? So if it makes sense, if it correlates with reality, if we're open to questions and it's practically life-changing, then those are good signs that we can, in a humble way, come to a grasp of some things in the world. And so I want to now propose that we approach Christian faith in that kind of way, and that we need to face up to this question, which is, why Christianity out of all the different religions in the world? Why Christianity? And I think the question that matters here is it true? Is it actually at its core true? Was Jesus God? Did God die on a cross? Did he really died for what's wrong with the world, to open up a doorway for us to be in a relationship with God. Is that true, or is that false? Of all of the different perspectives and religions out there, Christianity is based on truth, reasons, and argument and evidence in quite a unique way. You're very welcome to ask some questions about that in a moment, but Christianity is unique in the way it rests on evidence and reasons. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul ties the message and the preaching of the gospel in the early church to the event of the resurrection. He says, if the resurrection didn't happen, our message is meaningless, our faith is meaningless. What are we preaching? We're to be pitied. But if it really did happen, then we have a hope. So in a special and a unique way, Jesus alone claimed that he was God himself. And then he backed that up. He substantiated that, which is a good clue that God is interested in our minds as well as our heart response. Jesus claimed that he was God himself, and he backed that up with miracles and rising from the dead. And Jesus Christ himself claims in John chapter 14, verse 16, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So if those things happened, if that's real, what Jesus did and said, if the New Testament picture of Christ is accurate and real, then I think for a reasonable person, you have to say, well, maybe my search for God is over. Maybe I found him. And if Christ is who he claimed to be, then he is revealing truth to us. And in that, we can be confident that that's real. The truth that Jesus Christ reveals to us is that God is not an option or a bolt-on or an add-on, like a sort of bolt-on to our mobile phone contracts or an app we might put on our phone. But God is the center of life. He's the operating system. He's the air. He's the reality that we live in. And that without God in our lives, something may be missing. Jesus also tells us an uncomfortable truth, that God is utterly and completely pure, holy, clean, and good. And human beings are in need of friendship with God, not just for fulfillment, but also because the truth is that because God is holy and pure, we all need forgiveness for our lack of care for each other, for our choices sometimes, for how we think and feel and act sometimes, for our tendencies, for making other things more important than God in our lives. Many of us find that we are aware of things that we substitute for God in our lives. Jesus came to explain that God loves us. He demonstrated and then showed this great love on the cross. And by taking the consequences of our choices on the cross, this means we can be forgiven. It opens up the possibility of a friendship with God, and we can enjoy peace with God. Now, we can just sort of reject this out of hand, but I think you've got to investigate it first. I don't know, I know a few of you, but I don't know all of you. But I do know something about you tonight. I know that you're in this moment now, and you're between two unknowns, the unknown of where you come from and the unknown of where you'll go. And that we've each got to make sense of our lives. And unless we've given up completely on the adventure and the exploring of life and asking questions, I really hope you haven't given up on exploring and finding out what life's all about. But life is the most amazing adventure to be explored. And there are amazing questions to be asked of life. What is life about? Where are we going? What's going to happen to us? What can we hope for? What should we do? How can we deal with human nature? What is our reason for being here, if there is one? And the only real response to an adventure, like a couple of hobbits found, the only real response to an adventure is to embrace it, to explore, to go on the journey, which might mean for you that we need to ask the hard questions. Well, we can observe and we can test and we can think through the claims around Christ before we take any kind of step towards him personally. Christ has provided evidence so a reasonable person can come to a humble realism, a humble confidence about who he says he is. We can look into that, we can criticize it, we can discuss it, we can explore it, and we can think about it. Nothing terrible is going to happen to you tonight if you open Mark's gospel and read it and ask yourself, who was he? Did this really happen? Let me pause there and invite your questions at this point. Okay, thank you, Nico. Question one, what about divisiveness within Christianity? It's quite interesting. If you look back into the early church, there were different viewpoints being expressed even early on in the Christian story. But there was a core agreement about the fundamental creeds that they believed. So I think that it's sad that there is disagreement in the church, but I think it's because we're free to believe. There's a huge amount of agreement in common about who Jesus is, about the nature of God, about what Jesus is achieving on the cross, about the nature of God's offer of relationship, his answer. So I think it's, I remember once, thinking, is the answer to all of these different opinions in the church, is the answer to this that we all need to make reasonable compromises and everybody just sort of agree, lay down a few things and try to find enough to agree on that we sort of can come to more of a uniformity and uniform agreement? And then I thought, well, maybe if I just encourage people around me to listen to Jesus and to follow him, maybe he'll sort it out. Maybe he'll figure it out with each of them. I know that when somebody comes to me and challenges me and says, Tom, don't believe that thing, last thing I'm going to do is just throw it away. I'm just going to really need to get into a conversation with them. And I think that we agree on the main things and the core things, the important things across Christian churches across the world. I've been fortunate to travel to about 50 different countries. I've lived on a couple of different continents, and I've experienced church in all sorts of places around the world. I've seen student Christian communities, I've seen different denominations, and had the experience over the last 15 years or so of ministry, 20 years of ministry, to see just how differently people experience and express their faith. But I am also struck with how much agreement there is. I could listen to a Bolivian church pastor preaching in the jungle, the Amazon jungle, and him saying, these are the core ideas of the faith, and you'd find the same ideas being extolled in Hong Kong, and the same ideas in Ashtead, and the same ideas in South Africa and in Eastern Europe. The core ideas are clear. And I think it was Spurgeon who said, it's not the things that I'm not clear about the faith that I struggle with, but it's the things that are clear. They present me with the biggest challenge personally. Thank you for the question. Question two, how would you respond to a Jew who believes that Jesus isn't the Messiah? Well, I think I would open up the Bible and I'd look at how the early church, and I'd look at how Paul and Peter engaged with Jewish communities. Paul began in every city he went to, in every place he went to the synagogue, and he reasoned and he proved from the scriptures and persuaded from the scriptures that Jesus was the promised Messiah, that Jesus was the Christ. And I think that would be my starting point. A bit like Jesus asks the teacher of the law when he asks him the question, how do we, who is my neighbor? How do I inherit eternal life? I think it's in Mark 10. Jesus asks this question and he pushes him back into his understanding of Torah, of law. And I think that's the space to talk about for somebody who is coming from a Hebrew background, is I'd want to talk about, the different prophecies about what we expect from the Messiah, what Messiah is going to be like. I know that the organization Jews for Jesus have loads of interesting resources here in this area. And I know that there's loads of stuff on their website as well that could be quite useful, but I think I'd copy the early church. I'd start with the scriptures, the Old Testament, the law, and I'd start with that as a starting point. But even if that is the tradition and that's the background, every single one of us as human beings has got questions, human questions that we all wrestle with. We might say there are questions of how should I live? What should my moral outlook be? what's reality? What's the nature of the world? What can I hope for in the future? How do I know things? There are all sorts of, as a philosopher, lots of questions that are out there that we all have to wrestle with. And even if we sort of, just binge on Netflix, those questions are still there for human beings to answer. I think every single human being, Jew and Gentile alike, has questions about themselves, about their lives. And it might be that actually there might be more purchase and connection with somebody in engaging in those questions and engaging in what they're really asking. I think I'd want to ask and listen a lot too, and to say, what is it that you wonder about? What is it that you are asking about? What would it be for you, the thing that would help you to consider or weigh up the claims of Christ for yourself? Thank you for that question. Question 3. How does the argument that as human beings, as humans, we all should have equal rights affect the discussion that different faiths have the same right and weight in presenting the truth? I was listening to quite an interesting discussion by I think he's a Harvard political philosopher, Michael Sandel, and he was discussing how you have these different bases for how people encounter each other and how you structure society. And he was contrasting systems that are built on rights with systems that are based on an idea of value, like being made in the image of God. And I think that this question kind of gets to this idea, it opens up this idea of equal rights, and it opens up this question of, how do we see each other? How do we relate to each other? I think that every single religion should have the opportunity to present and to air and to have their beliefs have a good hearing in the public space. I think that we should equip people to think, and equip people to think through the ideas, but also to hear and to value ideas, even ideas that they don't agree with. I would support the freedom of Islamic societies or of other religious groupings to hold awareness weeks and outreach weeks. I think that's entirely fair and appropriate, and I think that's part of a society that's just and tolerant. I'm not afraid of that public discussion of ideas, and I don't think that the gospel explained clearly is something that would flounder and have a problem in that public discussion. In fact, I think when you ask the most heartfelt and the most serious questions that human beings can actually ask, I think the gospel is a profoundly powerful answer to our human questions. So I'd be there defending the rights of people to proclaim different belief systems and to explain different belief systems. I'd still believe humbly that Jesus is the way and that he answers these questions like nobody else. But I would want to defend and live in a society where there is that freedom in the public square to have beliefs heard. What's the option? The other option is you push everything underground, and things are not exposed to the light and don't get critical questions asked of them. In theological scholarship, one of the things that I think is really important is that we're bringing ideas into contact, ideas that are in society into contact with scholarship, and we're thinking them through rigorously. That's really, really helpful, because otherwise you get these pockets of extremist belief around the world and around the country, and they're not exposed to questions, they're not exposed to the light. So I really believe that we should have thoroughly open discussions in education and in public life together of all sorts of religious beliefs.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think my mic is working again. A question that's quite interesting here is, does God approach different cultures in different ways?
Well, he certainly approaches different people in different ways. I don't think any story of Jesus interacting with anybody in scripture is the same. Jesus is not like using the same line or the same question or the same story when he talks to multiple different people. He's just utterly individually different with each person he talks to. With the woman by the well in John chapter 4, he's using these amazing, he's got these insights about her life. And she says to her friends, come and meet somebody who knew all about me, who told me all about my life. He knew my whole life. He knew everything. And Jesus is there gently offering her in the middle of the day, breaking her isolation and her alienation from the culture around her. He's offering her a drink. He's asking her for a drink, but in that conversation, he's offering her a drink of living water. And then you have all sorts of other encounters where Jesus is engaging with people through proverbs, through questions. Jesus asks hundreds of unique questions of people. So I think God does interact with people in different ways, in different cultures. I think that God seeks to reach out to each of us in different ways, all the way through our lives. And I notice, sometimes God is sort of speaking to me very clearly through something I'm reading in the Bible. Other times he's speaking to me through a conversation or through an event that's happening in my life. I find sometimes, especially as I go through life and experience, suffering at different stages, I find sometimes God speaks to me through the events of suffering in my life. He brings my attention to things and causes me to notice things through that experience, causes me to value things differently. And it could be that, in different cultures and different places around the world, God is reaching out in different ways. There are certainly an interesting number of stories from countries where it's harder to preach the gospel publicly, where it's harder to explain Christian faith openly and publicly. There are an interesting number of stories about dreams and visions that people have in those cultures, where they encounter Christ, or they hear about Christ, or they have a vision of Christ, and he tells them to go and wait in a place, and then somebody turns up and gives them a Bible. And there are extraordinary sort of correlation of those stories with cultures where it's harder to preach the gospel.
Another question here, which is quite interesting, is someone kind of, when they were searching for answers, I saw the story of God on Netflix, which is led by Morgan Freeman. And I guess, I haven't seen it, but I guess the kind of message is quite sort of, all religions are looking for the same thing. But actually, to have so many religions and so many people searching, in a way means that that there is a hunger in people's lives, and that we were created with that hunger. So that in a way has helped someone in their journey to actually find that Jesus was the solution. And so is there something about having many religions, or so much kind of search for religion, that actually is helps in the idea that we were created to search for God?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. A couple of different thoughts on that. I think the common religious impulse is something that might make us lean in and say, okay, this seems to be a universally felt yearning or longing. That in itself, for me, isn't enough to prove that it's true. I would need to have some revealed insight, information, data, some sort of clarification of, okay, is this more than just a yearning? Because you can sort of yearn for the perfect a car or the perfect lover, but it doesn't mean that they're out there. You might, your yearning might just be, just a yearning. So I think it's an inclination that there's something interesting happening with human beings, and that would cause me to lean in. But I don't think I would depend on that yearning itself, because it's slightly, it's not really information laden in a very deep way. It doesn't have specific and detailed information about religious truths within it, within recognizing that yearning. C.S. Lewis did go into a bit more detail on this, where he talked about the different kinds of yearning. He talked about 3 different kinds of longing. He talked about a longing for home or safety. He talked about a longing for intimacy and for closeness. That sort of idea that even if you really share your heart with somebody, you'll never completely be able to let down all the walls and all the barriers, and you'll be aware that you could be more deeply known. And in the same way, the yearning for home for him, which he talked about in terms of heaven, the longing for heaven, was partly a longing for safety, a longing for a place where there isn't more pain, where we're secure and where we're okay. And then the third longing that he talked about was a longing for purity and wholeness and integration, the sort of the longing of the aesthetic sort of saint, the longing of a wholeness and settledness and calmness in the heart and soul. It's interesting how some commentators looking at society now have talked about the fragmentation of our modern identities and how we're different people in different places. And Lewis is pointing to this longing to be whole, longing to be home, longing to be loved. The only other thing I would say is that some cognitive science is looking at how we might be hardwired to believe in God. My field, this is sort of interesting sort of side angle. My field is I'm looking at what's called the problem of divine hiddenness. Why does God sometimes seem hidden? Why doesn't God seem to reveal himself sometimes? Now, some people are arguing in that there's some sort of suppressed knowledge of God, that we're pushing down the knowledge of God that's in our hearts. And if we really were honest, we would discover this knowledge of God. There's something to it. It's useful, but the idea that we might be hardwired, if recognized by atheists and agnostics and skeptics around the world, would suggest that there's certainly some suppression going on. If we're hardwired biologically to believe, then we're at least pushing down that. And so that might give me another response I could make in divine hiddenness. But that is, as I say, a bit of a sidetrack.
Oh, it's really interesting. And then if you were saying that kind of the media and the kind of general culture is saying faith should be private, should be something you keep by yourself and not share, then how do we kind of engage with that when we want to talk about this, or we want to share with others, or actually even someone searching, if everything's very private and sort of that's what you do at home, how would someone who's kind of interested discover if the culture's kind of going against that?
I think just like being aware of it, like just sort of being aware that there's a certain approach in culture now that's kind of everywhere, which is this thinking of don't think that you can know the truth, don't think you can really have a confident, humble grasp of the way things really are. And just being aware of that, I think, is helpful, because it just sort of means that you can choose whether or not you take that up and agree with that, or whether you say, no, I actually am more attracted to this kind of humble realism where I do know some things. This humble realism is also, we need to bear in mind that this is what we need to be able to have moral confidence about things in the world. If we look back over the last 50, 100 years, there are things that have happened in Europe that we need to be able to describe as wrong. We need to be able to have a moral confidence to say certain acts, certain behaviors people do are wrong. So that, I think, does give us pause for thought in agreeing that we don't really know things. But when it comes to religious truths, that's maybe a slightly different thing. I think the first thing to do is to ask your questions, is to not be put off by anybody saying the sort of easy answers of, well, just don't ask those questions. People will say to you, don't ask your questions, there's no answers. People will say things like, you'll never really know, you can never really find out. I think just stay optimistic and keep asking, keep persisting. Jesus either was this amazing person, or he was completely, unhinged and crazy. Nobody reading about Jesus, investigating him, looking at him, walks away thinking that he was a crazy person. In fact, there's a whole tradition of barristers, of detectives, of investigative journalists. So the sort of 3 or 4 groups of people in society who are hottest on pursuing evidence and following the argument where it leads. There's a massive tradition of these individuals starting off skeptical about Jesus and Christian belief, and then coming back from that and saying, actually, we've found something incredible here. We found something amazing here. Nicky Gumbel, who started the Alpha Course, is one example of a barrister who looked into it and explored it and came to faith.
Yeah, there's loads of questions, but I'm going to keep to last 3, and if we can try and kind of answer these 3, and then we'll have to kind of continue. But there's loads of really good questions. It's a bit of a shame, isn't it, when you have lots of questions to ask, but we can't kind of stay here till 10 p.m. But one question is, if the kind of the big religion in the UK now is secularism, how do you kind of think of kind of faith in a pluralistic world where that's the main religion? How do we kind of live with maybe those 2 religions or ways of seeing the world?
So I'd want to make a distinction here between approaches to society, approaches to culture, approaches to how you structure society, and actual religious beliefs that people hold. The sociologist who was at Exeter for a long time, Grace Davie, has written various analysis of European and British religious attitudes data, and it actually shows that people's underlying beliefs have not largely changed at all. People have not become more and more unbelieving. In fact, what the data shows this is from Grace Davie and from her book, Europe, the Exceptional Case. And the point is that she's looking at is why in almost every nation, every continent in the world where Christianity is growing and growing, it should have been dying out when there's been more education. That was what was expected with this whole secularization sort of hypothesis. But actually it's growing everywhere. Why in Europe is it not growing? What's going on? And her answer is that models of church in Europe haven't evolved with people and with their way of life and with what they're after. And so you've actually got a continent that's not unbelieving or more secular in their sort of beliefs. They haven't become godless. Actually, people believe, but they don't see church as being the natural landing point for the community for where they express those beliefs. So you've got a need for church planting, for new models of church to be created. But I would gently sort of say, well, maybe we're not as secular as we think we are. And the data seems to bear that out. So we're also having this discussion, aren't we, about like what model of the public square should we adopt? And this is part of what I was speaking to when I was talking about rights earlier. One model of the public square is that it should be entirely secular, that there should be no religious expression, no values in it. House of Lords shouldn't have, bishops. You shouldn't have any kind of you shouldn't have the Queen of head of the state and the church. You shouldn't have these sort of instantiations in public life of that because the secular system would say no, remove all that stuff, keep the church and the state completely separate. We must create secular life together. The problem, as John Lennox points out, the problem with that is nobody starts from zero. Is that a secular state isn't neutral. It's a particular worldview. I think instead what we should be looking for is what Os Guinness calls is the civil public square, where you have religious entities that are in the public square, but they have no greater right to be heard than anybody else. And we must have a free and fair debate and a free and fair discussion of ideas. And that should be our public discourse together. If that's what secularism is, if it's a public square where ideas are welcomed, where it's okay to have some of these religious entities in the public square, then I think that's a free and open society. That's the sort of society that I want to be part of and I think is healthy. I don't think that we need to be nervous about religious voices. If people have to make the argument and they have to make the argument in its own right, and it's not very good just to appeal to the Bible in making that argument. We've got to make arguments alongside everybody else. Does that help a bit with that question?
It does. I think it's a really good answer, because it's all about being transparent and investigating, and we want that context.
Because in the same way as sort of our public life is like that, I think our private life, like we should be open to hearing ideas publicly and personally.
Yeah, and test our beliefs as well, because if we are hoping that others will question themselves, we are able to question as well and decide if this is all true or not. There's a few really good questions, but I'm just going to have to kind of cut out some. But
shall I come back?
You can come back tomorrow and answer, or stay till 12 o'clock. But one question here is, sometimes people are presented with facts, data, clues, and everything. You share everything, and yet it's very difficult for people to believe. So the question is, so can faith only truly come from within the individual? Is it kind of more, at the end of the day, the person's choice, even if you've kind of used all your arguments or shared all your arguments with them?
Yeah, I think it is a person's choice. The mathematician Blaise Pascal wrote, he never quite finished it, or at least he got the fragments of it. He wrote a book called The Pensée. And in The Pensée, he talked about how God doesn't want to force the mind to believe, because he wants to woo or allow the heart to freely come to believe. And this comes down to actually who we think God is and what God is like. If God is a kind of overruling creator, a bit like a sort of heavenly speed camera, and if God is just sort of this speed camera, this cosmic speed camera that's flashing when we do things wrong, then I think that the sort of response that being is going to want is acknowledgement and behavior, conformity and good behavior. It's going to be primarily a sort of moral response, behave yourself, stop messing around. However, the God who is there, who's revealed in Jesus, if that's correct, then that God who's actually there is a family. 3 persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, one being. 3 different persons, a bit like you have a conscious mind and an unconscious mind. 3 persons, one person. What's 3 persons, one being? That family of God, those 3 persons, they are a loving, generous, life-giving family. And actually, the reason why there's a creation and a cosmos at all is because the love and the life of that family, that heavenly family, overflows. Creation is the celebration of the divine love of God in the heart of God. So that's why there's a creation. So God then creates beings and individuals for relationship, not for just behavior, for relationship. And so I don't know if you've ever, if you can, I don't know if you've had the experience of trying to win a friend or trying to win somebody's affection. You can't force them. You might be able to give them flowers or do nice gestures, but they have to choose to want to be your friend. I remember a dreadful story that doesn't reflect well on me from when I was at school. I was at boarding schools, and I was at one school in Bath, and the school went co-educational. It went co-educational while I was at the school, and I started talking to a girl, and I'd never really related to girls terribly much before that. But I started talking to this girl, and I decided that I quite liked her. I was about sort of, 13 or so years old, 13, 14 years old. And I decided I'd write her a love letter because that's what people did in movies. And so I sort of, declared my love for her. I created this huge, great big letter. I used the proper fountain pen that my parents got me to go away to school and write letters to them. I don't think I wrote them one letter with it, but anyway, I used the writing pad and the pen, and I wrote her this love letter. I put it on her desk after prep and ran away into the night. Hid somewhere. Anyway, a bit later on, we'd been going for long walks over the playing fields, and it had been going great. And I thought, this might be okay. Anyway, the look on her face was just sort of awkward shock when I saw her. Our friendship was so strange after that. It was so odd. We never really recovered the friendship after that point. It was just weird. If God told you how much he loved you, then I think that it might in some way change the nature of a future relationship. If God forced you to want to be with him and forced you to, I think God wants to woo us gently. Maybe if I played it cool, things would have gone differently with the girl from school. I'm pretty happy with what I've ended up with. Thank you, Peter and Janet Levinson and Andy Bridges. I'm pretty stoked with how I've ended up. Has been God's plan for me. But in these sorts of moments, we sometimes see stories of how God how God dances this sort of divine dance towards our will, towards our heart. He invites us to know him if we want to, but you can't be forced. So faith, yes, it can be a thinking thing. There can be arguments, there can be reasons. The early church and the story of the early church is absolutely shining. And there's so many examples of them going out and persuading and reasoning. The Apostle Paul's ministry, summarized by Michael Green in his commentary as the word persuade and reasoned with people for the gospel. On the other hand, people are still completely free to walk away. Hundreds of people heard Jesus, the best evangelist, and walked away from him. So there's always a freedom, and God always invites that, because the very nature of the God who is there is he wants relationship, and he won't coerce that. He won't force that. he wants to invite us, not to force us.
So, for everyone, we're kind of going to be around for another 10 minutes, but we like to ask the speakers to kind of share your story, your journey. Why are you kind of decided to follow Jesus? Why are you kind of now living your life for him, or sharing this kind of story with everyone? Really lovely to hear from you, kind of your personal story.
So I'd arrived at university as a fairly open-minded Buddhist, atheist kind of guy. I was doing a computer science degree with a bit of philosophy, and I started to realize that the questions in philosophy were quite interesting and quite profound. I'd never heard or encountered intellectual Christianity before. I'd never heard of Christian philosophy or Christian philosophers. I'd never heard of theologians who engage with human questions and real questions. And I found it hugely interesting and helpful. I started to look around on my course next to me, spotting John Levinson in my lectures, an active member of the CU. And gradually, I came to faith during my first year of my undergraduate degree. I just got to a point where I decided, through the arguments of philosophy, actually also through watching some movies, those movies raised human questions, a bit like a book and an article and an op-ed can raise one type of question, but a poem and a song can raise questions in a whole other way, can't it? So I felt that films were raising personal questions for me, philosophy was helping me with intellectual questions. And I got to a point where I gradually moved to agnosticism, and then I moved to a kind of belief in something, and then I moved towards Christianity. So I was actually sort of believing Christianity was true before I was praying or before I was having any kind of encounter with God or any kind of connection with God personally. I got to a point one night where I just sat down and said to myself, I'm not living what I think is real. Deep down, I'm not living what I think is real. I'm not being honest, and I want to be honest. I think, God, you're here, but I don't know you, and I want to know you. And so I just knelt down in my room in Reading, my student house, in my student bedsit. And there were like 10 boys in the house. It was complete anarchy. But I just knelt down in all of that and just held my hands out. And I said, God, I think you're there. I need you to make me clean and to forgive me. I need you to help me to be the person that you want me to be. I want to follow you. That was my prayer. It was like, it wasn't like sort of the Lord's Prayer, sort of really nice sort of, it was just kind of a bit raw and a bit honest. And I began to experience forgiveness from God. I began to believe I was forgiven because I thought it was true. I began to experience a freedom and a peace with God. I began to experience reconciliation and peace with people in my life that I'd had, not great relationships with. I began to experience forgiveness and hope. I began to want to read the Bible. That was a bit weird, wanting to read the Bible, but I began to have this sort of desire to find out what God thought about things. And I found other Christians who helped me grow, and found a good church where I was beginning to grow, and a pastor who would start to meet up with me and have pizza with me every couple of weeks. But I think the realization was this: connecting with God, a friendship with God, was not about trying to be good. It was not about trying to do things. It wasn't about trying to feel the right things. It was just about saying, I want to be friends with you, God. I think you're real. And I know that you need to forgive me for that door to be open. So I'm asking for that. And I found it really helpful to hear clearly what God thought of me as I began to read the Bible. And so if you're wondering this evening, if you're wondering what God might think of you in your questions and in your doubts, then let me just declare over you that you matter to him. You're valued by him, that you're not boring, you're not insignificant, you're not too rubbish for him. You matter deeply, deeply to Jesus. And God's given his son to catch your attention, to draw your attention and to woo your heart, that you might turn to him, that you might know him. The cross of Jesus, that crucifix that we wear around our necks and on earrings and that we see on churches, shows us who stands behind the cosmos and what this being thinks of us. The cross is an answer to the question, who is there? The cross and the resurrection of Christ don't just tell us about the rescue and how the rescue happens, but it also tells us about the rescuer. The cross tells you that you're wanted, that you're known, that you're loved, that your name is known, that God is real, and that a loving God is working through the pain and the suffering of our lives, but wrong things are seen, and that there is justice and there is mercy. I think sometimes I used to like to think about, I was seeking God, but what if God is seeking us? Nico, that's my part of my story, and I would invite anyone, even if you still have questions, if you think, okay, I think you might be there, God, I think you might be real, just to have an honest moment of reflection and just to say, okay, if you're there, you're holy. I still have questions, but I know I'm not holy, and I kind of think you're there. I need to ask for forgiveness. Yeah, that's me too. And I'll be praying that too. Like in the next sort of 5 or 10 minutes, that's my prayer every day is, I think you're there. I'm convinced you're there. I know I'm not holy. Will you forgive me? Will you help me? And the promise from the Bible, from Hebrews chapter 13 is chapter 13 verses 5 and 6. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. And so we can say with confidence, the Lord's my helper, and I don't need to be afraid. Nico.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks for sharing. We wanted to finish the last session with a song. So we've got Mirko, who is our worship leader, leading us in a song to reflect on everything we've been thinking the last 5 weeks. And after the song, I'm just going to say goodbye to everyone. But if we can just reflect on this song, and if it's your prayer to say, God, I want more, I want to be forgiven, and I want to get to know you, we'd love to encourage you to do that, and then to speak with me or anyone else in this chat afterwards, because we'd love to know how you're doing and know kind of your story as well. So let's listen to Mirko. If you want, you can join in with the singing as well, because nobody's going to hear you. Your mic is on mute, so you can sing as loud as you want. And Mirko's going to lead us in a reflective song.
It's who I am. who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. Love so undeniable, I can hardly speak. Peace so unexplainable, I can hardly think as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still into love, love, love. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am.
Thank you so much, Mirko. Thanks, Tom, for sharing as well. And we are here because we not only kind of believe in our hearts and in our minds that this is true, but also because we've experienced God in our lives. And we'd love to kind of chat with anyone who's interested or anyone who has more questions about this. This is kind of, God has become so important in our life that there's nothing like sharing God with others and sharing what he's done in our life. So please, if you've got any questions, everyone's got my emails, just put me an email. If you have big questions which you still feel are pretty much unanswered, I'd love to have a chat, a coffee, go for a walk and kind of explore those questions with you. But just a reminder that on the 20th of July, we'll have another session where we'll bring other questions in. And in October, we are doing an 8-week alpha where we can again discuss questions. But thanks so much for joining us throughout the course. It's been amazing. I'm going to miss my Tuesdays with all these really interesting, intelligent people sharing and kind of all the depth that they've shared. You can pick them up again on YouTube as well. So I'm just going to add Tom back so we can just say thanks, Tom. Thanks so much for sharing. It's been amazing to hear your story. And I'll ask afterwards maybe if you can share a few resources with. I'll send an email with a lot of resources. So any kind of interesting books you might recommend. But thanks so much for sharing. It's been great. Brilliant. Okay.
Don't forget those photos of Andy Bridges at the Holiday Club.
Oh yeah, I'll see. I'll probably blackmail him and see what I get.
No, whatever he offers, I'll give you more for the photo.
Yeah, no, we do have those pictures. Captain Spock, Andy Bridges. So thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Tom, and have a nice evening. And we'll see you as we continue with our week and our life together. Thanks. Bye-bye.